With regard to participation, while people are increasingly recognizing themselves as world citizens, we see, however, that civic and political participation actually remains very low.
Basically, citizenship, classic studies of citizenship, it's about status, right, identity, and participation. The essence of citizenship, in all its 4 dimensions, is constantly being remodeled, reformulated, and birthplace, language, and nationality may no longer be the major defining factors with respect to belonging and political community.
I mean that technology is triggering a series of changes, most importantly economic changes, which when combined with the technology produce a radically different social or political environment for people.
Okay, good morning, and thank you for joining us for the first CIT Tech Conference. We are very happy to see all of you. We will have hopefully exciting and challenging, also intensive two days, and then 1 more year of work until our next meeting next year. And we are considering, we'll talk about it tomorrow, we are considering to add another meeting. But let's start first of all with the framing of the topic. And the topic is emerging technologies and the future of citizenship. Now, emerging technologies characterized the 4th industrial revolution will fundamentally alter the institution of citizenship. The scale of this transformation is still unknown, but the direction is pretty clear. And this is that technologies are already blurring the line between the physical and the digital, the local and the global. And the purpose of this new project, CIT Tech, is to address the challenges and the opportunities that new technologies such as AI, blockchain, and machine learning pose to existing theories and practices of citizenship. Now, in essence, citizenship has 4 dimensions. So it's a legal status, which includes some rights and obligations, indicates an identity of some kind, and entails some level of civic and political participation. So basically, citizenship, classic studies of citizenship, it's about status, right, identity, and participation. The essence of citizenship, in all its 4 dimensions, is constantly being remodeled, reformulated, and birthplace, language, and nationality may no longer be the major defining factors with respect to belonging and political communities. And this is not a surprise to all of you that data becomes more central, perhaps faster than we think. So the conference, what we are trying to do with the conference is kind of to invite us to think beyond the conventional notion of citizenship and reflect on citizenship at a multiple dimension, municipal, national, regional, and global. And our intention, in brief, is to question the contemporary understanding of citizenship, to inspire reflection on the concept, a concept which is a concept in transition, and addresses the law and ethics of the new directions that may evolve. So we wish us a productive and enjoyable workshop. We are looking forward for the discussion. And without further ado, let me invite my colleagues, friend, and co-organizer of the conference, Primavera De Filippi, to take the lead. Primavera.
Nice, okay. Okay, so thank you. So the topic of the workshop is digital technology and the future of citizenship. And so what we want to do is really to take the institution of citizenship and to think how it can actually be deconstructed and perhaps reconstructed as a result of those new technological developments. And so digital technologies have the potential to affect the 4 dimensions of the institution of citizenship that Leah has described, both for the best and for the worst. And so with regard to identity, we are witnessing indeed the emergence of those new concepts of global identities that to some extent transcend the boundaries of the nation state. But at the same time, we also see several attempts at creating more local, more decentralized, or perhaps more community-oriented identities. With regard to participation, while people are increasingly recognizing themselves as world citizens, we see, however, that civic and political participation actually remains very low and often only happens locally at the municipality level or globally, but limited to a particular community or a group. And then, with regard to the legal dimensions, then we're wondering if we're actually witnessing the emergence of new institutional frameworks for citizenship. And do we need an actual new citizenship status that will better reflect the future or the emerging conception of those new virtual states? And then finally, with regard to rights and obligation, then can technology actually help enforce the human rights regime on previously marginalized individuals? Can it confer new rights to a new class of global citizens? Or are we actually just using this digital technology to implement those increasingly automated and obviously potentially biased processes for assigning citizens to a particular nation state? But of course, the notion of citizenship is actually just one piece of a much larger picture. And if we zoom out, then it becomes clear that as the most fundamental institution in Western politics, citizenship also constitutes one of the basic institutions of governance and governance. And so today there is a lot of debate going on about whether and how can we rely on technology to fix global governance problems, knowing that, of course, those problems are themselves caused by technology itself. And so as the push towards nationalism is actually becoming stronger in many areas of the world, and as corporate companies are gradually assuming some of the basic prerogatives of a state, then we need to rethink what does it mean to be a citizen in a globalized world. And this is particularly important today as we are moving into this increasingly connected world where a decision that is taken in one particular place will obviously and necessarily affect individuals in a different place. And so it is our belief that we cannot actually fix global governance issues without a proper institution of global citizenship. So, according to Saskia Sassen, governance is multiscalar. It does not take place only at the global scale, but also at the national and at the subnational scales. And the pursuit of global democratic governance cannot be confined to global institutions. It also needs to look at the national and subnational institution, but also individual citizen needs to be part of it. And so, analyzing the intersection between citizenship and global governance is leading us to actually focus on 5 separate points. So one is the role of the state in global governance. So how can the state participate in governing the global economy in spite of the trends towards deregulation and privatization, and in spite of the growing authorities of non-state actors? And can the state actually be a bridge to a politics of the global for citizens who are actually still largely confined to the national domain for the exercise of their powers? Secondly, the relationship between citizenship and states. So to what extent citizenship is fully formalized within the boundaries of a nation state, and to what extent the institution of citizenship might actually change, expand, or shrink beyond its national confinement. And for this, it is important that we distinguish between the post-national conception of citizenship, which is actually linked to the deterritorialization of citizens, for instance, in the case of the human rights regime, and on the other hand, the denationalization of specific features of citizenship, which are actually arising out of the changes in the actual state institutions themselves. And then third, the emergence of data-driven policies and data-driven governance, which is essentially the result, on the one hand, on the mass surveillance of state and corporation, and on the other hand, on citizens, which are actually increasingly providing data about themselves out of the willingness to actually benefit from a more customized or personalized services. And this essentially means that those who hold the data, which today are mostly those internet giants, can actually exercise power and potentially even political power, as we have seen recently with the case of Facebook. And this is extremely problematic also because this actually creates these kind of new digital citizens, which are actually defined through these algorithmical profiles. And then, for instance, with the case of the social credit in China, we are seeing that we are progressively moving away from an actual right regime towards a social rating algorithm. And then fourth, the rise of corporate citizenship, essentially given to the fact that corporations are increasingly acting as active participants in emerging form of global governance. And so the question is whether we are actually moving towards a new form of citizenship that is more akin to corporate citizenship. And then what does it even mean? Are we talking about corporation as citizen? Are we talking about corporation as governments in relationship to citizen? Or are we talking of corporation as political arenas in which people can actually act as citizens? And then finally, decentralization. So can we actually move towards more decentralized system? Can those new forms of global or community-based citizenship emerge out of new technological systems? For instance, we have blockchain technologies, we have those new concepts of decentralized virtual nation and so forth, which provide many new hopes and opportunities, but also come with very serious political challenges. And the main question here is whether this vision of voluntary participation to a particular virtual nation actually relates, how does it relate to the established conception of citizenship, which is actually enshrined around the traditional notion of civic participation, deliberation, and politics, which is ultimately grounded around the notion of compromising. And so those are all very important and difficult questions. And this is the question that we would like to explore with you during this workshop. But before we move on, we will enjoy a short musical interlude that will be brought to us by Revital Hashamov. So Revital is one of the leading pianists in the world, who has played in leading orchestra worldwide, including the Concerthaus Berlin. And this year, she is invited for the third time to play solo at Carnegie Hall in New York. And Revital is married to Professor Ehud Shapiro, who is attending the workshop. And so we saw this as a very great opportunity to bring her to this event. So thank you, Revital. Please go ahead.
Morning atmosphere, a short etude of Chopin that is called The Harp. Later on, I will play a piece that will be more energetic.
Thank you, Ravital. Okay, so we're going to now move to the actual meat of the workshop. So we have the privilege to have with us Professor Lawrence Lessig, who kindly agreed to deliver the opening keynote. So Professor Lessig needs no introduction, but let me say just a few words anyways. So he is the Roy Furman Professor at Harvard Law School and the former director of the Safra Center for Ethics at Harvard University. But Professor Lessig is not just an internationally renowned academic, he also deeply cares about bringing a change into this world. And in order to do so, he has been constantly applying his research to actual real-world problems, and he has been actively engaged in actually developing practical solutions to those problems. And so Lawrence Lessig is the founder of Creative Commons, which is a nonprofit organization devoted to support the free sharing of culture. He is the co-founder of Root Striker, which is a grassroots activist organization intended to fight political corruption in the United States. And Professor Lessig was also a candidate for the Democratic Party in the last presidential election in the US. And so I had the pleasure to meet Lawrence Lessig when I first joined the Creative Commons community back in 2010. And both his work and his passion have actually been extremely influential in my research and in my work all along the way. And so I'm very eager to hear what he has to tell us today. And I will actually not be surprised if this will actually inspire us to move beyond pure academic research and actually apply this research and actually try and put some of the outcomes of this workshop into practice. And so thank you, Lawrence, for joining us, and we are looking forward to hearing your talk.
It's already there. So thank you, Primavera, and I'm really grateful to be here. I want to demonstrate a certain approach to the question of governance in the context of technology. And it's an approach that I first described in my book, Code and Other Laws of Cyberspace, which was published 20 years ago. But what's striking about this conference is that that book grew out of a class that I taught at the Yale Law School, where Beth Novak was one of the key participants in that class. And in that class, I crystallized, in my own head at least, the challenge of thinking about regulation or policy in the digital age. And that challenge is to recognize the interaction between technology and ideals of policy, and how the changes in the technology reveal latent ambiguities in the values or the policy that we might have. And in those latent ambiguities, force us to choose what kind of people or what kind of polity we want to build. And at the end of my book, I addressed a bunch of latent ambiguities around the question of citizenship and digital identity, and I think that was the last time I thought about those issues. And so I'm eager to see how those thoughts have evolved and what new research can bring to it. What I want to do today is to complement that conversation with a related conversation about citizenship in the digital era, with a related latent ambiguity, I think, that we have now come to see. And my fear is that this latent ambiguity is going to force a choice on democracy that I'm not yet sure democracy is capable of making. So that's a little obscure and a little uncertain in its relationship, but I hope by the end of this talk, some of the obscurity disappears. Okay, so there's this slander that's made against the species of the frog. The slander is that the frog is incapable of discerning slight changes in the temperature of water being brought to a boil. And so if you drop a frog in boiling water, it will jump out. But if you put a frog in cold water and heat it up, it will not jump out, it will just die. Now that's a slander because it's just not true about frogs. But we like that allegory because it is true about us. Humans are not as smart as frogs. Humans are really pretty good at getting stuck in slow transitions and losing the ability to step back and recognize the consequence of those transitions. And I think in the last 20 years, we've seen two really clear examples of that. And what I want to talk about today is a third. And so these examples are changes which are a function of changes in technology. But I have to begin by avoiding a standard critique to this way of thinking about the world, which is, I don't mean only technology. I mean that technology is triggering a series of changes, most importantly economic changes, which when combined with the technology produce a radically different social or political environment for people. So the examples that are increasingly familiar include, for example, privacy. If you think just 20 years ago, which is possible for some of us, easier for some of us than some of you, but okay, if you think 20 years ago, it was perfectly possible to live a surveillance-free life, a life where you were confident nobody really could know what you were doing or where you were going or who you were talking to or what, in fact, you were interested in. That was the nature of the world circa 1998, because the technologies of surveillance were exceptional and infrequent. But it's an interesting exercise to think today just how far you could go without surveillance capturing the things you were interested in or things you were doing or the places you were going or the people you were interacting with, and the steps you would have to take today to achieve even the same level of surveillance-free living that we had 20 years ago. My suggestion is we've seen a radical change here, and yet no moment has democratic society stepped back and really said, is this change something we wish to embrace? Is this change something we want to support? Or maybe even more profound, we can think of it as solitude, or what I want to describe as kind of ad-free living. The spaces in our life where we can exist without the constant attention by advertisers to us in what we might want, by pounding into our consciousness decisions and choices that we might make on behalf of the advertisers. 30 years ago, there are plenty of spaces where one could exist without this mechanism of engagement capturing your existence. But we live today in this perpetual advertising space, and increasingly a presumption that everything, even that we own, will become owned by the advertisers. Cell phones, which build into the cell phone the capacity to advertise on the basis of where you happen to be, and the disability to disengage that capacity is increasingly a presumption of the business model of these technologies that radically change our ability to free ourselves or create the solitude around the existence that doesn't submit itself to this perpetual advertising. These changes, I want to suggest, are technology-driven, not just technology-driven, but technology-triggered. And the understanding that I want to develop here is an understanding about how those technological changes might affect these political values of citizenship. And the one I want to focus on, the latent ambiguity that I want to identify in this lecture, is an ambiguity about the idea of understanding itself, social understanding. Because I'm going to suggest that we've come from a time when societies, whether that's nations or cultures, or whatever level you want to describe, where societies could be said to have common views about the facts or common views about the world. And increasingly, we've moved into a world where there are no common views. That's an extreme claim, but no common view in the sense that a nation can't rely on a common view of the world in the way that it could before. And I think that this change will implicate fundamentally what we think of as democratic theory in a digital age. We could think of it as the problem of democratic epistemology in a digital age. And I want to describe that problem in the context of the United States, mainly because I think of the United States as a kind of canary in the coal mine. You know, we have this idea of canary in the coal mine where the coal miners would take canaries in with them, and if the canaries died, then they knew they needed to get out. I want you to recognize the way the United States is democracy's canary. So the pathologies that I'm going to describe in the United States about this question of common understanding, I don't think exist in the same way everywhere in the world, but I do think they will exist in the same way everywhere in the world if we don't exercise reflective democratic control of how these technologies are developing. Okay, and we can focus what I want to get you to recognize as the problem with this claim of the presumption of persistence. So I want to suggest that democratic theory today, as we experience it, has a presumption of persistence. And my objective by the end of this talk is to get you to reject the presumption of persistence. So what's persisting in this presumption? What's persisting is something called the will of the people. There's an idea that there's this thing called the will of the people, which is knowable, it is measurable, and in democracies it's to have some normative significance. It's the thing governments are supposed to pay attention to. And my claim is that we need to reject this idea of a presumption of persistence, and technology shows us why it must be rejected. And I want to argue instead that we think about the will of the people kind of the way we think about Schrödinger's cat. That the will of the people does not exist until it is constructed in a normatively appropriate way. And until it is constructed, it should have no normative significance over what a government or policymakers think a government or a people should do. It should have no normative significance, but obviously today it clearly does have normative significance. In the United States, when it was observed that 71% of Americans believe we should go to war in March of 2003, that fact was extremely important in rallying the nation to go to that most disastrous, devastating war. So it currently has normative significance, but my argument here is why it should not have normative significance, and begin to think about techniques to change its normative significance, because I think democracy needs to change it urgently. Okay, so step one here in this argument is to recognize first how bizarrely modern this notion of the will of the people is, or the way we now understand this notion of the will of the people. There's always been this idea of the will of the people, but before we had the technology of polling, the idea of the will of the people was always just a metaphor. It was interpretive. It was the sort of thing leaders told us existed in a certain form, but we had no way to actually measure or know it precisely. Kind of the way a Catholic priest describes the will of God to his parishioners. This is actually a Methodist priest, but I couldn't find a Catholic priest. But the point is, the idea of a person who speaks for God telling the public, you can't understand God except through me. So I'm going to tell you God's will, but God's will is not for you to touch. That's the sense of the will of the people for almost all of human history. And even that idea, that there was such a thing of the will of the people at any particular time, was not given. Hobbes, of course, had this idea of the sleeping sovereign, the sovereign in most times resting, oblivious to what's happening. What that means is that there's no persistent will of that sleeping sovereign. Instead, there's an episodic will. It might wake up and say, here's what I now want. But that's the moment in which we recognize there is a will of the people. Bruce Ackerman might think of these as the constitutional moments of the people expressing their will. But between these moments, the people sleep. And while sleeping, there is no present will. So in this historical sense, we've already recognized the sense in which the will is not persistent but episodic. And then for Hobbes, this was a feature. This was a good thing. But for later theorists, it was a bug. So James Bryce, who wrote this magnificent work in the late part of the 19th century called The American Commonwealth, theorizes throughout this book about the will of the people in America, but of course recognizes the imperfect access that anyone has to this idea of the will of the people. And he describes, quote, a final stage in the evolution of democracy would be reached, quote, if the will of the majority of citizens were to become ascertainable at all times. He's dreaming of a technology that would make it possible to pierce through and find the will of the people the way Martin Luther might want to pierce through and find the will of God, by finding access to the Bible directly instead of through this interpreter. And almost 50 years to the day, this man delivered Bryce his dream. George Gallup proved to the world that this final stage in the evolution of democracy had been reached because he proved to the world there was a way to reach through and understand the will of the people. In 1935, Gallup launched his technique for surveying in a scientifically robust way small samples of the public to understand what the people believed. And he demonstrated that quite dramatically in the 1936 election, where the then dominant technology for understanding the will of the people was displayed by something called Literary Digest. Literary Digest would collect mailed-in ballots predicting who would be the next president. And in the 1932 election, they were within 1 percentage point of predicting the election. So they thought they had perfected the method for understanding the people, and they collected more than 3 million ballots in 1936, and they predicted that Alf Landon would beat Franklin Roosevelt by more than 20 points. And so George Gallup startled the world when he, 4 months before the election, predicted that in fact Franklin Roosevelt would beat Alf Landon, and that in fact the Literary Digest would be radically mistaken in its estimation of what this election would produce. And in fact, as we know, or as we Americans know, the 1936 election was the largest landslide for a president, Roosevelt, in the history of American presidential elections, except for Washington's, the very first. So clearly had Gallup demonstrated his superior technology that literally the Literary Digest went bankrupt within 2 years, and that was the end of the publication. We had radically changed the way in which we understanding the public. The final stage of democracy had been achieved because we had a practical way to know what the people believed and wanted. And George Gallup spent an extraordinary chunk of his career convincing America that he had perfected democracy and that we should be sanguine about a democracy driven by what the people believed. As he wrote, "For myself, I have no hesitation in living in a country whose everyday citizens feel about major issues as the citizens of our country feel. I am frank to confess that I should rather trust the judgments of the majority than to trust my own individual judgments. If you say, let the people rule, you can count me to your side." Okay, yet we can miss, in this extraordinary explosion of attention around polling, the incredibly important fact about when this happened, about when polling happened. Because if polling had happened 50 years before, if it had happened when James Bryce fantasized it happening, it would have had a radically different effect on the nature and the future of democracy, because polling was coincident with the rise of broadcasting. It happens coincident with the rise of broadcasting for news. So during the term of Roosevelt, Gallup could report that in 39, 60% of Americans got their news from radio. By 44, it's 74% of Americans getting their news from radio. It's a rise with politics as television broadcasting radically changes the development of American politics. It rises for culture generally as we begin to understand culture differently, as people experience this reality of many hearing at one time, whether it's lies or truth. That's the dynamic of broadcasting. And it changes how culture knows, and it changes how culture grows. Now, in that story, all broadcasting is important, but television is the most important. As Marcus Pryor of Princeton describes in his extraordinary book, PostBroadcast Democracy, television changed everything about the way democracy in America worked. And not just because of the concentration of people's focus on television as a source of news. In 1977, 90% of Americans get their news from 3 television networks. But more importantly, because of its addictive quality. It is literally irresistible at the time it begins to dominate American culture in the 50s and the 1960s. A television would be turned on. The family could do nothing but to focus on it. It was the most interesting thing that there was. And so people were captured and in some sense forced to watch what was on those shows. And the networks coordinated when they would show news, so there was a certain hour in which only news was being shown. And this news was explaining to the public what was going on in the world in a very understandable way. Understandable both to people who read and to people who did not read. So it was an extraordinarily egalitarian intervention into politics. More citizens were engaged in mainstream trusted sources than ever before, and that developed a thick common understanding of what we could think of as a common set of facts. And it's on the basis of that common knowledge that political engagement grew and transformed. Now, I don't mean to say this was a golden era. Of course, what was discussed was narrow and biased, so not enough attention to poverty or race or sexism, no doubt. But for what was discussed, my only point is to recognize the way in which this technological platform produced a kind of public that literally had never existed before. And so my point then is to say we have to recognize that when polling was born, it was born to a very special kind of public. If we think in the history of American democracy, I want to suggest that there's a chunk, these are the outer boundaries of what we could call broadcast democracy. And they are bracketed on both sides with what we could call cacophony democracy. And polling is born at the moment that broadcast democracy begins to dominate. And yet it extends way beyond the time of broadcast democracy. But I want to say that because of broadcasting, building on Marcus Pryor's work, common knowledge was thick. That thickness produced a certain understanding in the public, could produce what we think of now as progress. That progress was reported in polling, and so we, the people, therefore seem smart as we see that progress as it's evinced through this polling. And so critical issues in American political society get resolved through this progress, whether it's civil rights or the Vietnam War or the struggles around environment. This progress makes a respectable public. And that respectable public becomes a normatively significant public. 71% of the public believes becomes a statement that now matters politically because we have some sense that we are touching a democratically authoritative and normatively serious source. Okay, so it's this weird, happy coincidence that we learned how to hear the people just at the moment when the people had something smart to say. And they had something smart to say because they knew a common set of facts. And knowing this common set of facts, they could deliberate and resolve issues in a way that strikes at least the elite of us as sensible. Okay, that's point one. Point two. What happens if we don't know a common set of facts? What happens if the technology makes it so that no longer is that presumption of common understanding true? Because if the final stage that Bryce was talking about was something that Gallup celebrated, we now need to think about the stage after the final stage. If we think about broadcast, we have to think now about post-broadcast. Because the drama of the change is hard to overstate. This is a picture of various market shares. This is the big three broadcasting networks beginning 1985 through 2002. And then these white bars are cable penetration, cable television as the alternative. And then this line describes the average number of channels on cable. So we go from just over 40% in 1985 having access to about 15 channels on cable to 2002 when more than 82% of Americans have access to more than 100 channels on cable. And so what that change does is to fragment attention. And cable, of course, is only the beginning. What we're here to talk about in these 2 days is the way the internet adds to that fragmentation, and it's not just in cable, but also in the extraordinary number of sources that produce content that people want to consume, producing fragmentation for both culture and democracy. And that fragmentation has a dramatic effect on what people watch. Those who were forced before, because there was nothing else that they wanted to do except to watch television, forced before to watch news, don't now watch news. They watch the movie channel, or they watch the home shopping network. And the remaining people focused on the news junkies, are increasingly partisan junkies. And that changes the business model of those news channels because partisanship pays. And the more partisan, the more it pays. So the point is to see the way the technical fragmentation yields an economic incentive to fragment even more. The media's business model is to polarize, which means the return from rendering issues partisan produces this interest in making us stupid, in making us more and more isolated in the world that we understand. Making us stupid becomes profitable for them. That's a product of fragmentation. And my point here is that if there was an intelligence before, the conditions for that intelligence have changed, they've disappeared. My own view is that's a great thing for culture. Something as great as the Game of Thrones is unimaginable in the 1960s. And, you know, Francis Fukuyama talked about the end of history, but I talk about the end of culture when I look at a show like Better Call Saul. What could be better in the history of human culture than this extraordinary... That's a joke, okay. But the point is, this is a terrible thing for knowledge, even if it's a great thing for culture. It's a terrible thing for common knowledge, which means it's a terrible thing for democracy. Common knowledge, political knowledge, becomes decimated in this context of a fragmented, technically and economically media environment. So if there was a public with a will before, there is no public now. Instead, there are many publics with many wills, and the presumption of normative authority that goes with the idea of the will of the public That presumption, presupposition, has an unrecognized, unstated, latent ambiguity here that has been eroded away because of this changing technical environment, and I think is now gone. Okay, so how do you respond to that change? Well, the anti-democracy response, which I increasingly hear when I travel to events where people talk about the problems of democracy, is to just say, well, we've now learned the people are absurd, so we should just ignore the people. We should develop systems for regulating or governing that don't depend on the people. The Chinese model is offered as an alternative, but it's not just the Chinese, the Singapore or maybe Rwandan models, these authoritarian systems that govern, they don't exercise democracy. And the pro-democracy response, really inspired by Habermas, is to think about ways in which we can reconstruct this public we should respect. And so when we think about how we could do that, some think about going back to the world of concentrated attention. I don't think that's possible. Or they think about educating the public better so that they're better able to understand these issues that they must, as citizens in a democracy, confront. And I don't think that's possible either. I think all of these responses are hopeless, but here's what's important about these responses. They all trade on the presumption that democracy needs us all. They're all about raising all the people, raising us all up, so that we are better able to be citizens in a democracy. They are all solutions in this presumption because they fix us all as we happen to be now. They take that to be the problem and they offer solutions to that problem. But here's the key to the argument I want to make today. I think we've got to give up that assumption, the assumption that democracy needs us all. We have to give up the assumption that we solve the problems of democracy in a digital age only by, in some sense, improving us all. I think we has normative significance. The idea of we, the people, has normative significance. But we have to give up the idea that we're talking about we as we happen to be right now. And instead recognize that the idea of we is always built, it's always constructed, it's always interpreted. The empirical sense of the Gallup poll is itself a construction. And so we must always defend how we get constructed. We have to justify one mode of construction versus another. I think you see this most dramatically if you think about us versus them. I want to think about the people versus government officials. That's them. Because we recognize the way government officials have views, and their views are always constructed. They're never just found. Justice Breyer, a justice on the United States Supreme Court, is a very smart guy, but nobody would presume to walk up to him on the street and say, what do you think about this weird question of admiralty? It's kind of impolite to frame a question in that way. The way you get Justice Breyer's views about a question of admiralty is you provide him with briefs and arguments and a chance to deliberate, and then he issues an opinion. And that is how we know what justices' views about important policy issues are. Or think about the president. Well, actually, he is the exception that proves the rule. Get him off the stage. So think about earlier presidents, right? So the point is, nobody presumes that we can just quiz the president and understand executive policy in America. We understand there's a way of understanding executive policy that is constructed through deliberation and reflection. Even Congress has a process for narrowing the scope of what the views of Congress are through a process that assures reflection and deliberation and opportunity for information. Each of these government officials have views, but their views are built, they are constructed, and they speak in a particular way, in a constructed way, and that way includes information, support, and reflection. That's how they speak. And in that process, they also have this extraordinary additional benefit of staff. So they get to speak, they get to develop their views, supported by an infrastructure of information that helps them come to sensible views. So why not for us, the people? Because we, the people, are said to have views, but because of George Gallup, our views have just found. We call someone up, we ask them their views on NATO or on the Korean Defense Initiative or on any other public issue. We call them up and we quiz them. And we get an answer, and the basis of that, and that answer then provides the basis for us understanding what we the people believe. Whoever happens to answer the phone, that's what we the people believe. We speak in a particular way right now through this George Gallup poll. And that way of speaking is not informed and supported and reflective. It is uninformed or differently informed. And in that process, we get no staff. So what do we expect, we the people would believe? It's obvious that we are rendered ridiculous, as no other public office is. They, government officials, get constructed as smart. We, the people, get constructed as ignorant. And the question we have to focus is, why do we allow that? There is no will. There is no presumption of persistence. Any will that there is, will of the people, must be constructed, and the only question we should be asking is, can the mode of construction be justified? Can the prepared and informed and reflective mode for them be justified? I think the answer is clearly yes. Can the random quiz, George Gallup poll for us be justified? I think the answer we need to recognize is obviously no. That way of understanding us is not justifiable. Okay, so these questions, can they be justified for them or justified for us, have a point. They point to certain, I think, really important research going on right now. So one way they point is to support the work of David van Reybrouck's really fantastic book, Against Elections. So if you've not read this book yet, you should. Reybrouck describes a history of representative democracy, and what he describes in this history is that representative democracy historically has always been ambiguous between elected representatives and randomly selected representatives, random or what's called sortition. And until the 17th century, the common view was elections in a representative democracy would tend towards aristocracy, and sortition, which was originally practiced, of course, in Greece and also in Florence and throughout other parts of Europe, would tend towards genuine democracy. But when it came to the 18th century, the French and the American Revolution, sortition was quickly forgotten. It's as if elections were the only way to make a democracy work. And as van Reybrouck describes, the revolutionaries, leaders in France and the US had no desire for sortition because they had no desire for democracy. What they wanted was an aristocratic representation, not in the negative sense, a kind of class-based aristocracy, but in a positive sense. They wanted a system that would select for the very best. Yet very quickly, we saw that the people being selected were not the best at all. And what we've seen in the last 50 years, I think, is this idea of elections as a tool of democracy becoming the only thing a democracy does. So the United States right now is the most extreme. We live in a world of perpetual campaigns, perpetual fundraising. Members of Congress, candidates for Congress spend anywhere between 30% and 70% of their time raising money to run their next election, dialing for dollars, but of course calling no more than about 100,000 Americans to raise the money they need to fund their election. And what that has produced, especially in the last 20 years, is that we have no capacity to govern anymore because of a perpetual cycle of elections. So now van Reybrouck, of course, understands we're not going to end elections in democracy. We're not just give them up. But what he suggests in his work is sortition as a kind of shadow to elected representatives. Think of jury service as a kind of civil service, a kind of hybrid model. And as you'll see, I hope, and in her paper, Beth's paper on crowd law connects directly to this conception of ways to think critically about the way we can bring people into the construction of an appropriate we. And I think the undoubted conclusion from von Rehbuck's work is that elections are obviously not obvious as the best ways to create representative democracy. So that's about selection. I think a little bit about the knowledge problem here. And this is where I think the work of Jim Fishkin and deliberative polls is so incredibly important. Deliberative polls are, of course, regular polls plus something. So you've got a representative sample, but it's a sample that's been informed. They've been given information, and based on the information they're given, they have the opportunity to deliberate and think, and over the course of their deliberation, their views evolve, and it's the evolved view that becomes the representative view for that public. So for example, exactly a year ago, I traveled to this extraordinary place, which is Mongolia. This is not a painting, this is actually a picture of people in Mongolia. This is a picture of people in Mongolia. In fact, this is a picture of Mongolia. This is a random selection representative of Mongolia. So here's 700 people collected from all across Mongolia. You know, Mongolia is a country with about 3 million people, but the size is about the size of Western Europe. So half of these people had spent 2 days on a bus coming to Ulaanbaatar to participate in this extraordinary deliberative poll, because Mongolia has passed a law that says before they are allowed to consider any amendment to their constitution, they have to run it through a deliberative poll. And so for a weekend, these people gathered and had been prepared through information provided in advance, and then they had questions and they deliberated to determine whether they liked these changes or not. Now, I came and I watched this as a constitutional law professor, convinced that these people would have no capacity at all to understand the really complex question they were asked to address. But as I listened to their deliberations over the course of that weekend, very quickly it was obvious they had understood what was at stake, and the ultimate resolutions they offered were incredibly sensible balances to a very complicated set of constitutional questions. These were not elected representatives, but they were not ignorant either. And in the sense of we the people, this was a kind of we could be proud of. And that result had a persuasive effect, didn't have any mandatory effect, but a persuasive effect on what the parliament ultimately did. Now that's the question, the ultimate challenge here. Can we make the results of things like deliberative polls persuasive? Because countries that have tried to adopt this method, Canada in particular, which has experimented with a wide range of sortition examples, which have produced results that have then been submitted to the public in referenda, and overwhelmingly the results have been rejected in the referenda. So the deliberative poll says we should do X, and the public says we should do not X. This leads one to wonder whether the public could ever be convinced there was a reason to defer or to believe in what the deliberative polls have done, as opposed to their own relatively uninformed view of what should happen. So this suggests we should think about strategies to raise the significance or the deference that might go with these alternative ways of understanding the we. And the strategies include first uttering the obvious here, which is that we are now rendered as ignorant. We, the people, are now rendered as ignorant unfairly, because, of course, government officials are not rendered as ignorant. I mean, they try to display themselves as ignorant, but they're not structurally rendered as ignorant, and unnecessarily, because we could provide alternative ways to render us that would render us not as ignorant. That's point one. Point two, we need to demonstrate alternatives repeatedly, many different examples of these better ways to understand what we might believe, and then institutionalize the practice of that, as they've done through law in Mongolia. You can imagine a parallel in the United States. Here's a dream. Imagine the United States identified different topics or problems, whether Social Security or how to deal with money in politics. These are issues that might be identified either by Congress or the president. And then once identified, the United States would convene, let's say, 5 different deliberative polls at the same time. Say 800 people in each of these deliberative polls running concurrently. Random representative publics given information and deliberating, and then producing their results, and their results then would advise the policymaker, whether Congress or the president, about what should be done. And if you had 5 deliberative polls run concurrently that all produced the same result, my suggestion, my intuition is that would be an enormously significant democratic event that the public would begin to think, why is it? How is it? What does it mean that these groups spoke in that way? So their advice would not be instead of representative democracy, but in addition to representative democracy. It would be maybe the inverse of Gresham's law, where this good will of the people could drive out the bad will of the people. So we'll always have Gallup polls, but we could imagine a world where we have deliberative polls that compete with the Gallup polls, and imagine a public that comes to understand how this alternative understanding of we the people maybe deserves more deference than it gets. Okay, let me just end with this reflection of why I think this is so salient. If you think back to 70 years ago, and you asked the question, post-World War II, what does the world need now? Not in the Dionne Warwick sense of what does the world need now as in love, but the answer that would have been given 70 years ago is that what the world needs now is democracy. And in fact, in the 70 years since then, that's what the world has gotten. And so we live in a time when only rogues would deny rule of the people. But what we recognize is that in fact, we don't actually have much rule of the people. Everywhere there is the view, across democracies in all but the Scandinavian or Nordic societies, that society is divided between an elite and the people. And the view of the people is that democracy represents the elite. So a key promise of democracy, that it would represent us equally, has, I think, failed across the globe. And global dissatisfaction with democracy, I think, has never been higher. This reality is, in my view, what fuels populism. And this populism, of course, can be very scary as we think about the figures across the world who manifest this ideal. But what scares me is not them. What scares me is the growing skepticism among people like us, among the elite, a skepticism about democracy itself. In response to the populism, the view of the elite is, what's wrong with the people? How could they be so stupid? What scares me is an elite sneer at this populist moment. Now, don't get me wrong, I am not, and I'm not pretending to be a populist. As a Harvard law professor, I make the elite for a living. But this response, this sneer, is obtuse. It's oblivious. It misses a critical truth about why we are here and an urgent need to fix it. In my view, we're here in part because of something in them, the government. I haven't described here that, but there's obvious failures in the way we've allowed government to evolve. But in addition to the failures in them, it's a failure in us too, in our understanding of the people. My focus today has been the something in us, the need to repair how we the people, get rendered in this democratic discourse. And if it's not the response that I've offered here, then I put to you, what is the response? Because the reality is we, the people today, are embarrassing. And it's an embarrassment as a consequence of a change in technology. And it's an embarrassment with consequences. Because what it does is greases the wheels of this democratic backsliding. The only resistance to this backsliding, I think, is in part to develop a better sense of us. Because if there is no reason to believe there's a reason to represent us, to allow the people to actually rule, then this very idea of democracy cannot survive. Thank you very much.
So before we go to lunch, two last points. First of all, allow me to join me to thank Professor Lessing for his presentation. Secondly, Revital, the floor is yours.
Beautiful.
But I'm not using so much the floor.
The chair.